Hi, I'm Josh, and even though I had to recently have a big discussion about religion when I did my review of Till We Have Faces not that long ago, I am back to that topic again, unfortunately. Now, I could just skip it and move on to less controversial things and other topics that won't cause you to unsubscribe from my channel, but I have this weird desire to review every single book I read for you and put it up on my channel. So here I am. Let us talk about the modern Margaret Atwood classic, The Handmaid's Tale, and its recent sequel, The Testaments. Although The Handmaid's Tale is a very well-known book, I will very briefly talk about it for those who might not be familiar. This is a work of dystopian fiction that looks at a world in which religious zealots and fundamentalists have taken over all of society and restructured it according to their own pretty out there beliefs. In the foreword in the book, Margaret Atwood herself describes her society in this way. And again, this was written in 1984 and published in 1985. So, it was written back in the 80s, and Margaret Atwood says, back in 1984, the main premise seemed, even to me, fairly outrageous. Would I be able to persuade readers that the United States of America had suffered a coup that had transformed an erstwhile liberal democracy into a literal-minded theocratic dictatorship? In the book, the Constitution and Congress are no longer. The Republic of Gilead is built on a foundation of the 17th century Puritan roots that have always lain beneath the modern-day America we thought we knew. So that is the society in which we find ourselves in The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale follows one point of view character, and that is a young woman who is living in this society in the role of a handmaid, and her role is very simply to make babies. Her role in society is to procreate and create more people. And so that's who we follow in The Handmaid's Tale. Now, quite recently, in 2019, Margaret Atwood finally, after all these years, wrote a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale called The Testaments. In this book, we actually have fast-forwarded 15 years after the events of The Handmaid's Tale take place. And this time we're following three different point of view characters. We are following another very young woman within that society named Agnes, who is going through schooling and training to become a handmaid when she is of age. We follow another young lady, sort of her counterpart, who is growing up in Canada, so she's outside of this dystopian society, living in what we would more recognize as kind of our modern day society. And then the third person we follow is one of the few women who has power within this society, a lady named Aunt Lydia, who we were introduced to in The Handmaid's Tale. So we are following these three different points of view, and we are in the late stages of this regime that has taken over American society, when cracks are starting to appear and things are starting to fall apart, and we follow how these three characters' stories converge and the events that occur as a result. So those are the foundations of the novels and the general premise. And let's just look a little bit into this structure of society that has been created by Margaret Atwood and how she has come up with it. So one thing that is kind of frightening about these novels is the fact that right from the outset, when she started writing The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood was determined to create as realistic a scenario as possible, something that was very much within the realm of possibility. And that is because, as she explains here in the introduction, she grew up during the Second World War. It says, having been born in 1939 and come to consciousness during World War II, I knew that established orders could vanish overnight. Change could also be as fast as lightning. It can't happen here, could not be depended on. Anything could happen anywhere given the circumstances. Not only that, but she wanted everything that happens within this dystopian work to be something that actually happened in history and not veer off into what ifs or plausibilities. As she continues in the introduction here, she says, the form was strewn with pitfalls, among them a tendency to sermonize, a veering into allegory, and a lack of plausibility. If I was to create an imaginary garden, I wanted the toads in it to be real. One of my rules was that I would not put any events into the book that had not already happened in what James Joyce called the nightmare of history, nor any technology not already available. No imaginary gizmos, no imaginary laws, no imaginary atrocities. God is in the details, they say. So is the devil. Margaret Atwood further emphasizes this point in the Testaments. At the end of the book, there's a brief interview with Margaret Atwood where it gives the transcript of the interview at the back of the book here. So in this interview, from more than 30 years after publishing The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood talks about how in order to write The Handmaid's Tale, she started off by just clipping out things out of the newspapers that actually were happening in the world. And so in the interview, she says, so this is just stuff I came across when reading newspapers and magazines. I cut things out and put them in a box. I already knew what I was writing about, and this was backup, in case someone said, how did you make this up? As I've said about 1,000,000 times, I didn't make it up. This is the proof, everything in these boxes. And Margaret Atwood emphasizes this other point again in the Testaments when she says, like many books, The Handmaid's Tale began with the question, what if? I guess I was tired of having people say, it can't happen here. They were right only if you accepted their definition of it. It could mean Russian-style communism or Germany under Hitler, but what if we were looking at the wrong it? What if, while we were busily staring down the wolf at the door, another one was creeping over the back fence? Once any democracy starts curtailing freedom in the name of freedom, it may land us in trouble. What if you wanted to take over the US today? What flag could you wave successfully? The Handmaid's Tale is one answer to these what ifs, and it goes on from there. So it is interesting and sobering to note that Margaret Atwood stated, again, all these years later with the Testaments, that she feels our society is closer to the dystopia described in The Handmaid's Tale than when it was originally written in the mid-'80s. And I have first-hand experience from my own immersion within certain Christian societies. For over 3 decades, I myself was heavily immersed in Christianity in several different denominations throughout the years, and I have very much personally known people and been taught things that would very closely align with the things that are happening in The Handmaid's Tale. Not only that, but if you look in the right parts of the world, you can see it happening right now. So it's not within this specific form of fundamentalist Christianity that we see the dangers of these books, but if you look at certain parts of the Muslim world with ISIS and the full implementation of Sharia law, you see this dystopia currently at work where women have no rights. They are put into subservient, very specific roles, and they are living the life that is essentially described in these books. So we can't just pick on Christianity in this particular instance. And in fact, I would say that these books aren't anti-Christian books or anti-religious, because we see, for example, the Quakers, which is one particular sect or denomination of Christianity, acting as good people and against the evil regime as described here. Margaret Atwood says in the introduction here, she says, so the book is not anti-religion. It is against the use of religion as a front for tyranny, which is a different thing altogether. So yes, although I myself, after all those decades, have walked away from religion with certain opinions about it based on my life experiences, I'm not here to talk badly about religion in general, but about certain aspects, although they are fairly widespread in some cases, of religion that can lead to the real deterioration of society. So with that as our overall context, let me talk a little bit about the writing in these books, and then let's get into some specific things that are discussed within them. The first thing that's pretty wild to think about is the fact that Margaret Atwood, back in the 80s, wrote The Handmaid's Tale, the initial drafts, longhand. And as she says in the interview, in the back of the Testaments, the interviewer says, "Do you draft everything longhand first?" And Margaret says, "I pretty much did in those days, because they had not yet invented the personal computer. My typing was very bad. Here's one of the transcripts that came after the handwritten draft. Look at all the typos. I must have typed it in Berlin. It's full of umlauts because they have different keyboards." So she started by writing longhand and then switched to a typewriter and went on from there, which is interesting to think about books being written in that way and just the rewriting and the drafts, and I can't imagine the hand cramps. But one thing I will say about The Handmaid's Tale in particular, it is not a fun book to read. It is depressing and frightening and pretty awful. And what's kind of funny is that one of the point of view character, narrates this and kind of acknowledges it within the story itself. The character says, "I wish this story were different. I wish it were more civilized. I wish it showed me in a better light. If not happier, then at least more active, less hesitant, less distracted by trivia. I wish it had more shape. I wish it were about love, or about sudden realizations important to one's life, or even about sunsets, birds, rainstorms, or snow. Maybe it is about those things in a sense. But in the meantime, there's so much else getting in the way. So much whispering, so much speculation about others, so much gossip that cannot be verified, so many unsaid words, so much creeping about and secrecy. And there's so much time to be endured, time heavy as fried food or thick fog, and then all at once these red events like explosions on streets otherwise decorous and matronly and somnambulant. I'm sorry there's so much pain in this story. I'm sorry it's in fragments like a body caught in crossfire or pulled apart by force, but there's nothing I can do to change it." So there is this certain interesting acknowledgement from the narrator that they are telling a story that is going to be hopefully read in the future by somebody, and so they're kind of putting into words their own experiences. Now, despite the dark, heavy themes of the book, the writing itself is beautifully done and is almost poetic. Here are just a couple of quick instances I'm going to show you for examples. Our narrator here says, "I lie then inside the room, under the plaster eye in the ceiling, behind the white curtains, between the sheets, neatly as they, and step sideways out of my own time. Out of time. Though this is time, nor am I out of it. But the night is my time out. Where should I go?" And then later in the book, the narrator says this, "I wait for the household to assemble. Household, that is what we are. The commander is the head of the household. The house is what he holds, to have and to hold, till death do us part. The hold of a ship, hollow." So I really enjoy this playing with words and phrases and connecting one thing to the next with words. That is just really an interesting way of writing. Of course, it's not all written throughout the entire book in that manner, but there are these moments where the author or the narrator just has these moments of fancy where she starts to play with her words a little bit. Now, for as depressing as The Handmaid's Tale is, The Testaments is a little bit lighter in tone, and there is a little bit of humor scattered throughout. A couple of quick examples here. We have Aunt Lydia speaking, who's one of the heads of the organization that has taken over society, and she's talking to a character and sort of comforting her after she fell apart a little bit. And Aunt Lydia says, "A momentary psychotic break," I'd said. "The strain of being in a strange and debilitating environment such as Canada can have that effect. You did the right thing." Being a Canadian, I'm like, yeah, I guess in this case, it's a compliment based on the character that it's coming from, that Canada would be a strange environment. Later on, we are seeing a conversation between the young girl who's being raised within Gilead, within this environment. And because of the way that she's raised, she is an extremely literal person. She doesn't have any kind of nuance for kind of unusual turns of phrases and that sort of thing. So this young girl who's talking to another girl says, "I thought we should have a confidential talk," I said. She leaned forward, expecting gossip. "I'm all ears," she said. An untruth. Her ears were a small part of her, but I let that pass. I also appreciated this statement by one of the characters. It made me chuckle a little bit at kind of the truth of it too. And I'll just read it as written because I don't like the censorship of books or any of that nonsense, so I'll just read as written here. This time we're following the point of view of the Canadian girl, so that's our third point of view character. And that character says, "I guess she doesn't remember me," I said dolefully. "She doesn't give a fuck." "Nobody is an authority on the fucks other people give," said Ada. "She stayed away from you for your own good." Guess that's true. So overall, the writing is really excellent, and as Atwood stated, is all based on real life events. Next, I'm going to look a little bit more closely at the type of religion that this society is based on, this form of Christianity that's being followed. And what I describe for somebody who hasn't been within the Christian environment might sound pretty awful and pretty outrageous, but again, for somebody like me who was raised within that environment for the first few decades of my life, this is all so sadly normal and absolutely not out there in terms of what is being presented. And it turns out all the quotes I've pulled on this topic, I've pulled from the Testaments here. So here are some examples. And again, I will emphasize that the way that women are described in particular is a big part of this, the way that society has been formed, where women have been kind of reduced to the sole purpose of producing babies to grow society and removed from leadership roles with a very, very few exceptions. And these views of women are still being taught from pulpits in Christian churches today.
I still believe it'd be a cold day in hell before I get my theology from a woman. I'm a preacher. I wasn't Mama called, Papa sent. No woman ever got me involved in ministry. I didn't follow a woman in the ministry. A woman didn't write this book. Not one woman wrote the scriptures right here. A man wrote the Bible, got it from God. A man hung on the cross. His name is Jesus Christ. And God called a man to lead the church here. Hey, I'm glad I'm a man.
So these are not exaggerations by any means. And let's have a look at how they're described here. In this instance, we're looking at an event that is early on in the formation of the regime, where this group has overthrown the US government and taken power and started to establish their own laws and rules within society. And one of the leaders of the group is talking to a few of the women that he wants to set up in leadership roles. And he says, "Some might call the overthrowing of an illegitimate government an act of treason. Without a doubt, many have had this thought about me. Now that you have joined us, it is the same thoughts that others will have about you. But loyalty to a higher truth is not treason, for the ways of God are not the ways of man, and they are most emphatically not the ways of woman." You think that's far-fetched? Look at the takeover of the Capitol in the US that happened last year. There are very much groups and organizations that, if they had enough numbers, would enact an armed takeover and take power. So they're out there. In the next case here, we have Aunt Lydia having a conversation with another of the women leaders about how to convince a particularly rebellious young woman to conform to their standards. Specifically, they want this young woman to be more embracing of her role as a creator of babies. And so Aunt Lydia says, "No chance she might be brought to see the item in question as a means to an end, as a prelude to babies?" "None whatever," said Aunt Lise firmly. "That has been tried. Submission of women as ordained from the moment of creation? Everything we could think of." And that's one thing I was taught as a kid growing up, was that women were created to serve men, to be the supporters and proppers up of their men as the men led society. We carry on that similar idea with the younger girl who's being raised in Gilead in that environment. And she's talking about her own role and position as a young woman. And she thinks, "It was difficult never to speak unless one of the senior aunts spoke to me first. Obedience, subservience, docility, these were the virtues required." That same young lady continues to talk about her education here and says, "What my father was doing in his office was said to be very important. The important things that men did. Too important for females to meddle with because they had smaller brains that were incapable of thinking large thoughts, according to Aunt Vidala, who taught us religion." "It would be like trying to teach a cat to crochet," said Aunt Estee, who taught us crafts. "And that would make us laugh, because how ridiculous. Cats didn't even have fingers." And then we finish off by returning to that other young girl who was reluctant to be put into the role of a baby maker. And we have this rather disturbing idea. It says, her mother had told her not to be silly. She would never have a marriage offer like this again, and if she didn't take this one, the offers would become worse and worse the older she became. If she reached 18 unmarried, she'd be considered dried goods, and we would be out of the running for commanders. She'd be lucky to get even a guardian. Yeah, so that's the life that the women are leading in this book. And you don't have to go back far in our own history, in the history of the Western world, to see what the roles of women were like in comparison to the roles of men, and why they have had to fight so hard throughout history to at least get something approaching equality. And like I said, you can go to other countries, to other Muslim countries or other strictly religious areas where that is still the case. That is very much along the lines of the books here. Just a couple more things to wrap up the topic of religion and Christianity as it's presented in these books. And we have a point that I actually was kind of ranting about in my review of the book Till We Have Faces, where I talked about the book of Job, because there was a part in Till We Have Faces that was very much a parallel of the book of Job in the Bible, and where it's presented where Job had 10 kids and all this wonderful life. His kids all died and it was taken away from him, but then there was this happy ending where he was given all his wealth back and he had 10 new kids. And I'm thinking, but that's a happy ending? He still has 10 dead kids. Sure, he has 10 new kids, but that doesn't replace what he's lost. And I'm like, great, he got 10 new kids, but his 10 first children still died. How's he supposed to live with that? But it's presented as being a happy ending in the book of Job anyways. And it was hilarious to me that this book makes the exact same point here, where a young lady in Gilead is talking about the book of Job, and she says, I was pleased with this story. It was only later that I pondered it. How could Job have allowed God to fob off a batch of new children on him and expect him to pretend that the dead ones no longer mattered? And I was like, that's what I was trying to say. Anyways, here's one final good point, and then another one that I personally kind of relate to. So we have two people having a conversation about the experiences they've grown up with, and the one person says, everyone at the top of Gilead has lied to us. How do you mean? God isn't what they say, she said. She said you could believe in Gilead or you could believe in God, but not both. That was how she had managed her own crisis. I said that I wasn't sure I would be able to choose. Secretly, I feared that I would be unable to believe in either. Still, I wanted to believe. Indeed, I longed to. And in the end, how much of belief comes from longing? That is certainly one reason why it took me such a long time to finally and incrementally move away from Christianity and the religion that I was raised with and was implanted within me from the earliest age. This is the final part that I very much relate to, and I'm going to read it exactly as written again, but this time the character has self-censored herself. We have two characters on a boat talking about the big waves that they're dealing with, and one of the characters is getting sick from it, and she says, "Oh God," I said, "I hope they don't get any bigger. I hate throwing up." "Please do not use the name of God as a casual swear word," she said. "Sorry," I said, "but if you don't mind me saying, supposing there is a God, he has totally effed up my life." Just before I go on here, I want to take a quick second to thank my Patreon supporters, especially my higher tier supporters, Abe O, Saver Girl, Joanna, and King Booty, and most of all to my highest tier supporter, Osmandas Perfect. Oh hey, I just went out for a run after I recorded that video, and the temperature is this outside right now. So I'm practically dying. But what I forgot to mention is the whole reason I read The Handmaid's Tale to begin with is because I held a poll for my Patreon supporters where I listed all 50 standalone books of all genres that I have on my shelf here that I haven't read yet, and I allowed them to vote. And I came up with this complicated voted system where the higher of a support level you were on Patreon, the more your votes were worth, and you could pick your first, second, and third choice, and each choice would be worth more for first than for third. And after all that, only a single patron responded with a vote, and he voted for The Handmaid's Tale. So that's why I ended up reading it to begin with. I did end up getting a late vote from another patron long after the poll closed. So I'm going to be reading that book, I think, in the near future. But The whole point is, if you want to have a very good chance of picking a book for me to read the next time I do one of these votes, all you have to do is support me for $2 a month on Patreon, and you have a chance to potentially vote for a book that I read from all these wonderful books in the future. Anyways, back to what I was saying about The Handmaid's Tale. The next important topic we'll take a look at now is the idea of power, because that is kind of a big part of this whole thing. It is about the power of men over women, the power of specific men within the top tiers of society, and it is about the idea that somebody who feels powerless when they haven't enough capacity for violence can become dangerous, especially if they can use that fear and violence to gain and hold power. So the first thing we'll look at is this. The character thinks to herself, "I've had cause to notice over the course of what you might call my Gilead career that underlings given sudden power frequently become the worst abusers of it." Later on, we have a character who is arguing the fact that the establishment of this regime was done under noble ideas, but that as time has gone on, things have warped and changed. And this character claims the following. She says, "The aims of Gilead at the outset were pure and noble. We all agree," she said, "but they have been subverted and sullied by the selfish and the power mad, as so often happens in the course of history." And that is so true. I mean, it's one thing for somebody to overthrow leadership that they feel are corrupt or in the wrong, but whenever a power vacuum is created, it's always the most power mad that get into those leadership positions, typically again through fear and violence. And here is one step that has to be taken to be able to acquire that mentality that violence is okay. And a character named Luke says this, "I'll take care of it," Luke said. And then the other character thinks to herself, "And because he said it instead of her, I knew he meant kill. That is what you have to do before you kill," I thought. "You have to create an it where none was before. You do that first in your head, and then you make it real. So that's how they do it," I thought. I seemed never to have known that before. And that is so true. When you are creating people to become warriors, to go out and kill on behalf of their leadership or the government, their country, whatever it happens to be, you have to dehumanize the enemy in order to get just a regular everyday person to become a person who can kill another human being. And we see that even to this very day, where in the war in Ukraine, where the Russians are very much the aggressors, the nation that's in the wrong there, and those who are opposed to the Russians, Ukrainians and others who are fighting against them, refer to the individual Russian soldiers as orcs. So they are not thought of as fellow humans, but as hideous fantasy creatures, these orcs that they are called. And yeah, that's just one example of dehumanizing the enemy in order to be able to kill them. And there's this statement that I thought was interesting regarding being able to hold power once you have it. One of the Gileadian leaders is named Judd, and it says, "Judd, according to the Limpkin material, was of the opinion from the outset that the best and most cost-effective way to control women for reproductive and other purposes was through women themselves. For this there were many historical precedents. In fact, no empire imposed by force or otherwise has ever been without this feature, control of the indigenous by members of their own group. In the case of Gilead, there were many women willing to serve as aunts, either because of a genuine belief in what they called traditional values, or for the, does that sound familiar? Or for the benefits they might thereby acquire. When power is scarce, a little of it is tempting." And that's the thing, isn't it? Because power is held by so few people who are vastly outnumbered by the people they control, there has to be an element of complicity within the people they are controlling in order to hold on to that power, because they only keep that power so long as the people, the vast majority of people under them, are willing to let them have it. So without the complicity of some to hold back the people who might rise against those in power, you're not going to be able to hold on very long to your position. And then the final thing here reminded me of pretty much every internet interaction you could possibly ever have. And probably a lot of face-to-face interactions as well. A character is narrating saying, "In the disputes between us, she always had to be right. If you contradicted her, she would only repeat her first opinion, except louder." Yeah. Truly listening is a rare and valuable talent. The last concepts I'll talk about before I get into some things that related to me personally and then my overall rating of the books is an examination of life and death. So the people who found themselves living under this regime found themselves in a position where their lives had changed drastically and where death became closer to them than it was before. I'll start off with a good reminder for those of us who feel like we're going through hard times and perhaps have a hard time contextualizing just how much worse things can possibly be, especially when you start to look in other areas of the world or other societies. The character in The Handmaid's Tale is reminiscing to life before the takeover of the Gilead regime and the upending of everything in her life. And in thinking about her previous life, she says, "We thought we had such problems. How were we to know we were happy?" Yeah, back in those days, she thought they had so many problems that they were so unhappy. But now, in the situation she finds herself in now, she realizes just compared to the utter misery that she's living day to day, just how happy she was back then. And these people are finding themselves in a situation where life can almost be unbearable to keep on living. There's a case where one young lady actually took her life instead of being forced to carry on in the situation she found herself in, and two characters are talking and one says, "But why did she do it?" I asked. "Did she want to die?" "No one wants to die," said Becca, "but some people don't want to live in any of the ways that are allowed." That's true, and given the circumstances some people are in, it's hard to blame them. I liked this sentence that felt related to, and the character says, "But I forgive you in advance. I, too, was once like you, fatally hooked on life." Fatally hooked on life. It's an interesting turn of phrase. Here's a character who is thinking about the fact that she is finding herself to be very calm in the face of just horrible atrocities and events. And again, it's something that I find myself relating to a bit. It says, "All this time I was quite calm," which seems hard to believe, and in fact I no longer believe it. I was not quite calm. I was dead calm. As long as I thought of myself as already dead, untroubled by future cares, things would go easier for me. And really, the only true fearlessness comes when you truly don't care if you live or die. Which brings me to the next logical step and to a point that I really kind of feel strongly about: the whole idea of medical assistance in dying, helping people who are suffering horribly and terminally ill end their lives in peace. And one character says, "Right now I still have some choice in the matter. Not whether to die, but when and how. Isn't that freedom of a sort?" It's a very important freedom I think everybody should have to a certain extent. Given the suffering I've experienced in my own life and the things I've seen in my work as a paramedic over the years, I think it's an important thing. But let's end this dreary topic with this excellent word of advice. It says, "Live in the present. Make the most of it. It's all you've got." Fantastic advice. Now, let me just read a couple of things that kind of hit me on a very personal level, and then I'll talk about my ratings. As tends to happen, things will come to mind that remind me of my paramedic experience, and this one, especially when it comes to night shifts, switching back and forth between nights and days. In this case, though, this character is locked up in a totally dark room and says, "Time, however, is different when you're shut up in the dark alone. It's longer, nor do you know when you're asleep and when awake." I had a bit of that issue. Like I said, jumping back and forth with the night shifts, I would have dreams where I thought I was awake, and then when I was awake and so tired, I'd be like, am I actually awake or am I still dreaming? There's also this perspective you tend to get when you deal with dead and dying people, and you sort of lose your ability to be impressed by some humans over others. The character narrates, "At last the commander in charge of this service comes in. He's balding and squarely built and looks like an aging football coach. He's dressed in his uniform, sober black with the rows of insignia and decorations. It's hard not to be impressed, but I make an effort. I try to imagine him in bed with his wife and his handmaid, fertilizing away like mad, like a rutting salmon." It's true. The things we do to try to put us above other people, like, it reminds me of just seeing some clips online of people making fun of the coronation of King Charles, I think his name is, and just looking at these clips of the coronation, I'm like, you have a bunch of adults who are playing the most incredible form of dress up and taking it all so incredibly seriously. I'm like, what an absurd world we live in, that we somehow think these people are important because they actually make actual crowns and put them on their heads and call themselves kings and queens. What a crazy thing to deal with in 2023. Here's another kind of funny thing too, where the point that the character's trying to make is that in the world she's living in, tiny little things can be beautiful because so much around her is stark and unpleasant. In describing her environment, she says, "Not a dandelion in sight here. The lawns are picked clean. I long for one, just one, rubbishy and insolently random and hard to get rid of and perennially yellow as the sun, cheerful and plebeian, shining for all alike. Rings we would make from them, and crowns," speaking of crowns, "and necklaces, stains from the bitter milk on our fingers." A dandelion crown is so much more wonderful than the hunk of metal they stuck on King Charles's head, isn't it? But I'm the same way. My neighbors probably hate me. All these people who spray poison on their lawn and go around plucking up every little dandelion, whereas I let all my dandelions grow wild and free, and when they're in full bloom, I just think it's so beautiful, the dark green of the grass with the golden yellow of the dandelions. Why would you want to take all that away? But that's just my weirdness, I guess. But anyways, back to seriousness. This is something that troubles me. And the author says, "I wanted to feel my spouse lying beside me. I have them, these attacks of the past, like faintness, a wave sweeping over my head. Sometimes it can hardly be borne. What is to be done? What is to be done?" I thought. There is nothing to be done. Along similar lines, I appreciated this statement too. We have some women trying to calm some other upset women, and it says, "The women in charge handed them tissues. They said calm things like, 'You need to be strong.' They were trying to make things better. But it can put a lot of pressure on a person to be told they need to be strong." That's another thing I've learned. I really appreciate that statement. And now for one of the things I long for more than most other things in the life I lead, where I spend about 50% of my time alone and 50% of my time with my 2 children. We have a character, once again, thinking about her spouse and saying, "I want my spouse here so badly. I want to be held and told my name. I want to be valued in ways that I am not. I want to be more than valuable." But I think that's what we all want, isn't it? And the final quote that I'm going to wrap this up with is one that I think is interesting in context of this book, because humans have always been, up until the most recent times, creatures who lived in community, who, for most of our history, lived in small groups of extended families and tribes, and people who lived together and supported each other and lived in community. It's not until fairly recently in history that we started building huge cities and living with all these people around us, yet very much individual, isolated lives. And this idea of personal freedom at the cost of anything else from a societal perspective is the wrong way of looking at it, I think. We are most healthy and I think deal with the fewest number of mental illnesses when we are connected with others and we exist within communities and a supportive society. But what's interesting about these books is now they kind of have developed a society where they are all an interdependent society where each person plays their own role within it, but they all are kind of a interworking group. So we got the men in their leadership roles, we got the women in their baby making and support roles, and they do have this kind of society, but all the individuals within this structure they've created are so very alone and lonely. Even the people at the very top, as is presented in the books, live in a certain amount of fear and isolation. So it's kind of an example of the wrong way to develop an interdependent society. And all of this is why I appreciate this final quote so much, that is going back to this character who was locked up in isolation without contact with other people, and the character says, "You'd be surprised how quickly the mind goes soggy in the absence of other people. One person alone is not a full person. We exist in relation to others. I was one person. I risked becoming no person." And I just love that. We exist in relation to others. And I think in the very isolated, lonely, electronically connected world that we live in, I think we forget that a lot, and I think it's a very important thing to remember. So all of that being said, what do I rate these books? And this is hard. The Handmaid's Tale, like I said from the outset, was not a fun read, was not an enjoyable experience. There was a little bit of a plot and story that gradually worked towards something, but it was more a presentation of an environment and feelings and what it's like to be within this particular society. In fact, to me, reading this book reminded me of kind of the very beginning of a rocket launch, where it does build this fascinating setting and atmosphere, but the plot itself is like the early stages of a rocket launch. You get the steam beginning to billow, then there's noise and vibrations, then huge clouds of smoke, and just as the rocket is beginning to leave the ground, the book ends. And I'm left going, what have I gotten out of this book? I think maybe to people who are less familiar with certain religious groups, with certain organizations who are trying to push our society towards this dystopian future, it might be a bit of an eye-opening or even perhaps educational book. It might be one that is worthwhile for them to read. For me, who sort of grew up in environments that made me very much aware of everything here already, I'm not picking up a lot here that's necessarily new to me, nor am I enjoying the story very much. So from an enjoyment perspective, it was difficult. Even though the book is so well written as a work of dystopian fiction, it is very well done. So if I rate it based on how much I enjoyed reading the book, it's going to be what, a 3 out of 10? If I rate it based on how well written it is and what a great job in creating the setting and atmosphere and the feeling of it all, it's like a 9 out of 10. So do I rate it on how good a book it is or how much I enjoyed it? At the end, I might just compromise and go in the middle and give it maybe a 6 out of 10. I think that's probably where I'll end up with that one. Now, The Testaments, on the other hand, is one that I enjoyed reading a lot more because it was much more focused on an interesting interwoven plot with 3 different point of view characters who had each a very different point of view within this world and who came together in a very interesting way. And we had big events that it was working up towards, and we get kind of a satisfying conclusion to the book, which we don't necessarily have in The Handmaid's Tale. So from an enjoyment perspective, I did like the book a lot more, and I would probably rate this one a 7.5 out of 10. I didn't enjoy it a ton. I thought it was kind of an enjoyable read and an interesting read. But again, it was just so well written and so well presented, and I'm glad that Margaret Atwood finally took the time to come back to her story and provide a bit of a sequel and a bit of a more satisfying conclusion to her overall story here. So yeah, well, it's not a duology in the fact that it is one single story told over 2 books. They are obviously very much connected with each other, and I'm happy giving them separate ratings as opposed to combining them into a single rating. Anyways, I've gone on a long time, and if you're still here, my goodness, I'm so grateful to you for spending so much time with me. Please do reward all my work with a thumb up. Or if you disliked what I had to say, go ahead and give me a thumb down and get in the comments and let me know. Either way, whatever thoughts came up as I was talking about all this stuff, please get into the comments section and let's talk about it some more. Or if you don't feel like talking about these books, what books have you been reading lately? What have you been enjoying? Do let me know, and I'm interested in hearing about it. And of course, if you're willing to help me out, please do subscribe. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. Cheers. And again, Margaret talks about, so in this interview, Margaret and she said, what my father was doing in there, and it is I seem never have it had a much and a bit of an overview of the